The autumn rain drummed against the windows of Larry Gatlin's modest apartment in East Nashville, creating a melancholic symphony that seemed to echo the rhythm of his declining career. At 75, the country music legend sat hunched over his kitchen table, surrounded by unpaid bills and rejection letters from venues that once fought to book him. The golden era of the Gatlin brothers had long passed, and Larry found himself navigating the harsh reality of an industry that had moved on without him. His weathered fingers traced the edges of a faded photograph showing him and his brothers on stage at the Grand Ole Opry, their faces beaming with the confidence of men who believed their star would never fade. Those days felt like a lifetime ago, back when All the Gold in California topped the charts and their harmonies filled stadiums across America. Now, the silence in his small apartment was deafening, broken only by the persistent patter of rain and the occasional creak of old floorboards. The phone's shrill ring cut through the afternoon gloom, making Larry jump slightly. He recognized the number immediately. Marcus Thompson, his longtime manager, and one of the few people in the industry who still believed in him. Marcus had been with Larry through the peaks and valleys of his career, a steadfast friend who refused to abandon ship even when the waters grew rough. "Larry, I've got something," Marcus said without preamble, his voice carrying a mixture of hope and caution. "It's not the Bridgestone Arena, but it's a gig." Larry straightened in his chair, feeling a familiar flutter of anticipation that he'd almost forgotten existed. "I'm listening." "The Riverside Community Theater in Germantown. They're doing a benefit series, local artists supporting local causes. The pay isn't much, probably around $3,000, but it's a real show, Larry. Real people who want to hear real music." $3,000. Larry's mortgage payment alone was twice that amount, and his savings account had been steadily depleting for months. Still, it was work, and more importantly, it was a chance to do what he was born to do: perform. The Riverside Theater was a small venue, maybe 300 seats, but it had character. He'd driven past it countless times, admiring its vintage marquee and the way it seemed to hold onto the charm of a bygone era. "When?" Larry asked, already knowing he'd accept regardless of the details. 2 weeks from Saturday, 7 o'clock show. The theme is Community Hearts. They're partnering with local social services to highlight families and individuals who could use some support. Apparently, they're expecting a mixed crowd, not just the usual country music demographic. Larry nodded, even though Marcus couldn't see him. The idea of performing for a diverse audience both excited and intimidated him. For too long, he'd been singing to the same faces at county fairs and small-town festivals, people who remembered him from his heyday but who couldn't fill the seats anymore. This felt different, like a chance to connect with people who might hear his music with fresh ears. "I'll take it," Larry said, his voice stronger than it had been in months. "Tell them Larry Gatlin will be there." After hanging up, Larry walked to the window and stared out at the rain-soaked streets of Nashville. Germantown was a neighborhood in transition, where gentrification bumped up against long-time residents who'd called it home for generations. It was a community where stories lived in every corner, where struggle and hope walked hand in hand down tree-lined streets. Perhaps, Larry thought, it was exactly where he needed to be. The next morning, Larry decided to drive through Germantown to get a feel for the area. The sun had finally broken through the clouds, casting everything in that golden Tennessee light that had inspired countless songs. He parked outside Riverside Community Theater and studied the building. It was smaller than he'd expected, with a brick facade that had seen better days but maintained an undeniable dignity. The marquee displayed upcoming shows, and Larry felt a small thrill seeing his name listed for the following weekend. As he sat in his truck, an older woman emerged from the building carrying a box of what appeared to be flyers. She had silver hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and wore jeans and a Nashville SC t-shirt. Something about her purposeful stride and the careful way she balanced the box suggested someone accustomed to managing multiple responsibilities simultaneously. Larry watched as she struggled with the box while trying to unlock her car, and something compelled him to get out and approach her. "Can I give you a hand with that?" he asked, his voice carrying the gentle politeness his mother had drilled into him decades ago. The woman looked up, her brown eyes registering surprise and then gratitude. "That would be wonderful, thank you. I'm Sarah Mitchell, by the way. I work with Metro Social Services, and I'm helping coordinate some of the community outreach for the benefit series." "Larry Gatlin," he replied, taking the box from her arms. It was heavier than expected, filled with brochures and information packets. "I'm actually performing here next Saturday." Sarah's face lit up with recognition. "You're Larry Gatlin. Oh my goodness, I grew up listening to your music. My father was a huge fan. He had all your albums. I Don't Wanna Cry was his favorite song." The mention of that particular song hit Larry unexpectedly hard. It had been one of their biggest hits, but more than that, it had been deeply personal. He'd written it during a difficult period in his life, and hearing that it had meant something to someone else's father created an instant connection he hadn't expected. "Your father had good taste," Larry said with a gentle smile. "What kind of outreach are you doing for the show?" Sarah's expression grew more serious, though her enthusiasm remained evident. "We're working with several families in the neighborhood who are going through tough times. The theater generously offered to reserve some seats for them, and we're hoping the evening will be both entertaining and inspiring. Sometimes people just need to know they're not forgotten, you know." Larry nodded, understanding more than Sarah could know. The feeling of being forgotten was something he'd become intimately familiar with over the past few years. What kinds of situations are these families facing? The usual struggles, unfortunately. Job loss, medical bills, housing insecurity. "We have a single mother who lost her job at the auto plant last month and is trying to keep her kids fed while looking for work. A veteran dealing with PTSD who's been having trouble maintaining employment. An elderly couple facing foreclosure because of medical debt. Real people with real problems, but also incredible strength and dignity." As Sarah spoke, Larry found himself genuinely moved by her passion and commitment. In an industry where authenticity was often manufactured for commercial purposes, here was someone who dealt with authentic human struggles every day. Her dedication was evident in the way she spoke about the families, not as case numbers or statistics, but as individuals deserving of respect and support. "Would it be possible," Larry asked slowly, "for me to meet some of these families before the show? I mean, if they're comfortable with it. I'd like to understand more about their stories." Sarah's surprise was evident. "Really? You'd want to do that?" "I would. I've spent most of my career singing about real life and real people. It seems like I should actually get to know some real life and real people, don't you think?" The warmth in Sarah's smile suggested she appreciated both his honesty and his interest. "I think that would be wonderful. Let me make some calls and see what I can arrange. Not everyone will be comfortable with it, and that's okay, but I suspect some would be honored to meet you." As they finished loading the box into Sarah's car, Larry felt something he hadn't experienced in years, a sense of purpose that extended beyond his own career concerns. The upcoming show suddenly felt less like just another gig and more like an opportunity to be part of something meaningful. "Sarah," he said as she prepared to drive away, "thank you for what you do. It takes a special person to dedicate their life to helping others." "Thank you for wanting to be part of it," she replied. "I have a feeling this show is going to be more special than anyone expects." Driving home through the winding streets of Germantown, Larry found himself noticing details he'd overlooked before. Children playing in small front yards despite the recent rain. Elderly residents sitting on porches, watching the world go by with the patience of people who'd seen many seasons change. Young families walking together, parents pushing strollers while older siblings ran ahead with the boundless energy of youth. These were the people Sarah worked with, the faces behind the statistics she'd mentioned. They were living their lives with the same hopes and struggles that had inspired country music for generations. Larry realized he'd lost touch with that reality somewhere along the way, become isolated in his own disappointments and failures to notice that real life was happening all around him. That evening, Larry sat at his piano for the first time in weeks. His fingers found familiar chords, but instead of running through his usual set list, he found himself playing around with melodies that felt fresh, inspired by the conversations and observations of the day. The music that emerged wasn't polished or complete, but it carried an emotional weight that had been missing from his recent performances. As the sun set over Nashville, painting his apartment in shades of amber and gold, Larry Gatlin felt the stirring of something he'd thought was lost forever. The excitement of creating music that mattered, of being part of something larger than himself. The upcoming show at Riverside Community Theater was still a week away, but already it was changing him in ways he couldn't fully understand. The rain had stopped, and the evening air carried the fresh scent of possibility. For the first time in months, Larry went to bed feeling hopeful about tomorrow, eager to discover what stories and connections awaited him in the days ahead. The stage was set, both literally and figuratively, for something extraordinary to unfold. The morning sun filtered through the windows of Morningside Cafe in Germantown, where Larry Gatlin sat across from Sarah Mitchell, nervously stirring his coffee. It had been 3 days since their chance meeting at the theater, and Sarah had arranged for him to meet Maria Rodriguez, one of the families she'd mentioned. The cafe buzzed with the comfortable energy of a neighborhood gathering place, where regulars greeted each other by name, and conversations flowed easily from table to table. "She should be here any minute," Sarah said, checking her phone. "Maria's always punctual, even when life throws her curveballs. She's been through a lot recently, but she's one of the strongest people I know." Larry adjusted his baseball cap, feeling oddly nervous about the meeting. It had been years since he'd had a conversation with someone outside the music industry that wasn't about his career or lack thereof. The prospect of meeting Maria felt both important and intimidating. He wanted to make a good impression, but wasn't sure how to connect with someone whose experiences were so different from his own. The cafe door chimed, and Sarah waved toward a woman in her mid-30s who entered with 3 children in tow. Maria Rodriguez moved with the efficient grace of someone accustomed to managing multiple responsibilities simultaneously. Her dark hair was pulled back in a neat ponytail, and despite the stress lines around her eyes, her smile was warm and genuine when she spotted Sarah. "I'm sorry I'm a few minutes late," Maria said as she approached their table, herding her children with practiced ease. Isabella had a meltdown about her shoes, and then Diego couldn't find his backpack. The children, 2 boys and a girl, ranging in age from about 6 to 12, clustered around their mother with the instinctive closeness of kids who sensed their world was less stable than it once was. The oldest, Isabella, studied Larry with curious eyes, while the younger boys seemed more interested in the display case of pastries behind the counter. "Maria, I'd like you to meet Larry Gatlin," Sarah said. "Larry, this is Maria Rodriguez and her children, Isabella, Diego, and little Miguel." Maria's eyes widened with recognition and surprise. "The Larry Gatlin? The singer? Oh my goodness, my grandmother loved your music. She used to play your songs while she cooked Sunday dinner. Said they reminded her of home, even though she'd been in Nashville for 30 years. The mention of Maria's grandmother touched Larry unexpectedly. He'd always known his music reached people, but hearing these personal connections reminded him why he'd fallen in love with performing in the first place. "Your grandmother sounds like she had excellent taste," he said with a gentle smile. "What was her name?" "Carmen Rodriguez. She passed away 2 years ago, but she always said music was what made a house feel like home. Even when we didn't have much, we had music." Larry noticed the way Maria's voice changed when she mentioned not having much, a subtle shift that suggested current struggles rather than past ones. Sarah had mentioned Maria lost her job at the auto plant, but seeing her with her children made the reality of that situation more concrete and urgent. "Would you and the kids like to sit down?" Larry asked, gesturing toward the larger table Sarah had reserved. "Maybe grab some breakfast? My treat." Maria hesitated, and Larry recognized the pride of someone who wasn't comfortable accepting charity. "Please," he added quickly. "I was hoping to get to know you and your family a bit before the show on Saturday. Consider it research for a songwriter." That seemed to ease Maria's discomfort, framing the invitation as a favor to him rather than charity for her. They settled around the table, and Larry watched as Maria efficiently managed drink orders and breakfast choices for her children while maintaining conversation with the adults. Her organizational skills and patience were impressive, especially given what Sarah had told him about their current circumstances. "So what kind of work did you do at the plant?" Larry asked after the waitress had taken their orders. Quality control supervisor, Maria replied, a note of pride in her voice. 15 years, worked my way up from the floor. I loved that job. Good benefits, steady schedule, great team. But when they downsized last month, seniority didn't matter as much as we thought it would. Isabella, who had been quietly listening to the adult conversation, suddenly spoke up. Mom's been sending out job applications every day. She has a whole system with spreadsheets and everything. Maria looked slightly embarrassed by her daughter's revelation, but Larry found it impressive rather than pitiable. Sounds like you're approaching it professionally, he said. That kind of organization and persistence will pay off. I hope so, Maria said softly. Unemployment benefits help, but they don't cover everything, and they won't last forever. I'm trying to stay positive for the kids, but honestly, some days are harder than others. Diego, the middle child, had been drawing on a napkin with crayons the cafe provided. He held up his artwork, a remarkably detailed drawing of what appeared to be a stage with a figure holding a guitar. Is this what you'll look like on Saturday? He asked Larry. Larry studied the drawing with genuine appreciation. The boy had captured something essential about performance, the connection between artist and audience that went beyond mere entertainment. That's pretty amazing, Diego. You're quite an artist. The boy beamed at the compliment, and Larry noticed how the simple praise seemed to lift not just Diego's spirits but his mother's as well. These small moments of recognition and encouragement clearly mattered in ways that went beyond their immediate impact. Diego draws constantly, Maria explained. He's always creating something. Pictures, stories, little comic books. Even with everything that's been going on, he keeps making art. Sometimes I think kids are more resilient than adults. Art has a way of helping us process things we can't express otherwise, Larry said, thinking of his own relationship with music during difficult periods. Have you ever thought about art classes for him? Maria's expression flickered with something Larry recognized as the pain of wanting to provide opportunities she couldn't afford. Those kinds of programs usually cost money we don't have right now, but maybe someday, when things settle down. The conversation was interrupted by Miguel, the youngest, who had been unusually quiet. Mom, he said in a small voice, are we going to have to move again? The question hung in the air like a weight, and Larry saw Maria's composure falter for just a moment before she gathered herself. We're going to figure it out, baby. Mama's working on it. Sarah reached across the table and squeezed Maria's hand. We're all working on it, she said firmly. That's what community means. Larry found himself deeply moved by the exchange. Here was a family facing genuine uncertainty and hardship, yet Maria was maintaining her dignity and strength for her children's sake. The courage that required was something he'd never fully appreciated, having spent most of his life focused on the relatively trivial problems of the entertainment industry. Maria, Larry said carefully, would it be okay if I dedicated a song to your grandmother Carmen on Saturday night? I'd like to honor her memory and her love of music. Tears gathered in Maria's eyes, and she nodded without speaking for a moment. When she found her voice, it was thick with emotion. She would have been so proud. She always said music was God's way of reminding us we're not alone. The breakfast continued with lighter conversation, but Larry found himself studying the family with new eyes. Isabella's mature way of helping her younger brothers. Diego's creative spirit that persisted despite their circumstances. Miguel's quiet sensitivity to the tensions he couldn't fully understand. And Maria's steady strength that held it all together. After they finished eating, the children ran outside to play on the small playground next to the cafe, while the adults continued talking. Larry learned more about Maria's situation. How she'd been a single mother since her ex-husband left when Miguel was a baby. How she'd built a stable life through hard work and determination. How the sudden job loss had upended everything she'd carefully constructed. The hardest part, Maria confided, isn't the financial stress, though that's real. It's feeling like I've failed my kids somehow. They didn't ask for any of this uncertainty. You haven't failed anyone, Sarah said firmly. Economic forces beyond your control eliminated your job. That's not failure. That's life throwing you a curveball. Larry nodded agreement, but he was thinking about something deeper. In all his years of writing songs about heartbreak, loss, and redemption, he'd never truly captured the kind of strength Maria was displaying. His struggles with career decline suddenly seemed less significant compared to a mother trying to maintain stability for her children in the face of genuine hardship. "Maria," he said slowly, "would you mind if I asked you something personal? What keeps you going when things get really tough?" She considered the question seriously before answering. "My kids, obviously. But also, I guess it's knowing that this is temporary. Jobs come and go, money comes and goes, but family is forever. As long as we're together and healthy, we can figure out the rest." The simplicity and power of that perspective struck Larry profoundly. Here was wisdom earned through experience, not philosophy learned from books. Maria had distilled life down to its essential truths and found strength in that clarity. As they prepared to leave the cafe, Larry felt compelled to do something, though he wasn't sure what. The family's situation weighed on him, but he sensed that direct offers of financial help would be unwelcome, at least at this stage of their relationship. "Maria," he said, "would you be interested in bringing the kids to a sound check on Saturday afternoon? Diego might enjoy seeing how everything works behind the scenes, and Isabella seems like she'd ask great questions about the music." The invitation was met with enthusiasm from the children, who had been eavesdropping from the playground. Maria looked pleased but cautious. "Are you sure? We don't want to be in the way." "You wouldn't be. Actually, having an audience during sound check might help me remember what this is really about. Connecting with people, not just performing songs." As they said their goodbyes in the cafe parking lot, Larry watched Maria guide her children toward their older but well-maintained Honda Civic. The car showed signs of careful maintenance despite its age, another indication of Maria's practical approach to making the best of their situation. Driving home, Larry found himself thinking about the morning's conversations. He'd expected to feel sorry for Maria and her family, but instead, he felt inspired by their resilience and impressed by their dignity. They were facing real challenges, but they were facing them together with grace and determination. That afternoon, Larry called Marcus Thompson and asked about the possibility of extending his set time on Saturday night. "I want to make this show really count," he explained. "These people deserve more than just a standard 45-minute set." "The theater will probably be happy to give you more time," Marcus replied. "But Larry, what's gotten into you? You sound different, more engaged than you have in years." Larry thought about how to answer that question. "I think I'm remembering why I started making music in the first place. It wasn't just about success or recognition. It was about connecting with people and telling stories that mattered. Well, whatever's happening, I like it. This is the Larry Gatlin I remember from the early days, when you wrote songs that came from somewhere real." After hanging up, Larry sat at his piano and found himself playing melodies that felt more honest and emotionally connected than anything he'd written in years. The music emerging wasn't polished or commercial, but it carried the weight of real experience and genuine emotion. As evening approached, Larry made a decision that surprised even him. He was going to make Saturday night's show about more than just his own career revival. He was going to make it about community, connection, and the kinds of stories that actually mattered in people's lives. The plan forming in his mind was still vague, but it felt right in a way that nothing had felt right in years. For the first time since his career began declining, Larry Gatlin was excited about performing, not because of what it might do for him, but because of what it might do for others. The Nashville Community Center on Woodland Street hummed with quiet activity on Thursday afternoon, as Larry Gatlin followed Sarah Mitchell through corridors lined with colorful children's artwork and community announcements. They were on their way to meet James Thompson, the veteran Sarah had mentioned during their first conversation. Larry had requested this meeting after being so moved by his encounter with Maria Rodriguez and her children. He wanted to understand more about the people who would be in his audience on Saturday night. "James has been coming to our veterans support group for about 6 months," Sarah explained as they walked. "He's 42, served 3 tours in Afghanistan, and he's been struggling to find steady work since returning to civilian life. PTSD makes job interviews challenging, but he's incredibly talented. He used to repair helicopters in the Army. They stopped outside a workshop room where the sound of tools and quiet conversation drifted through the half-open door. Sarah knocked gently before entering, and Larry followed her into a space that immediately impressed him with its organized efficiency. Several veterans were working on various projects: furniture repair, small electronics, woodworking, while a bearded man in his 40s supervised and offered guidance. "James, I'd like you to meet someone," Sarah called out. James Thompson looked up from the antique radio he was carefully disassembling, and Larry was struck by the man's immediate presence. Tall and lean, with prematurely gray hair and intelligent green eyes, James carried himself with military bearing despite the civilian clothes. His hands, Larry noticed, moved with the precision of someone accustomed to detailed mechanical work. "James Thompson," he said, extending a hand with a firm grip. "Sarah mentioned you might stop by, Mr. Gatlin. I have to say, your music got me through some tough nights overseas. Houston means I'm one day closer to you was practically the anthem of my second deployment." Larry felt the familiar mixture of pride and humility that came with learning his music had provided comfort to someone in difficult circumstances. But James's mention of tough nights overseas carried weight that went beyond casual appreciation for entertainment. "Thank you for your service," Larry replied, meaning it sincerely. "And please call me Larry. Sarah tells me you're pretty handy with repairs." James gestured toward the radio he'd been working on. "This old Philco belongs to Mrs. Chen down the street. Her late husband bought it for their first anniversary in 1954, and it stopped working last month. She brought it here hoping someone could fix it rather than throwing it away." Larry examined the vintage radio, noting the careful way James had labeled each removed component. "Do you think you can bring it back to life?" "Oh, absolutely. It just needs some new capacitors and a good cleaning. The real challenge isn't the technical work. It's understanding why this radio matters so much to Mrs. Chen. When I hand it back to her working again, I'm not just returning a repaired appliance. I'm giving her back a piece of her history with her husband." The insight impressed Larry. James clearly understood that his work went beyond mere technical skill. He was preserving connections and memories that had deep emotional significance for their owners. "That's beautiful, actually," Larry said. "In a way, it's not so different from what I try to do with music. Take something that might be broken or forgotten and find a way to make it meaningful again." James nodded thoughtfully. "I never thought about it that way, but you're right. We're both in the restoration business, aren't we?" Sarah had mentioned James struggled with PTSD, and Larry found himself curious about how that affected his daily life. But he sensed this wasn't the time or place for such personal questions. Instead, he focused on the present moment and the obvious skill James brought to his work. "How long have you been doing electronics repair?" Larry asked. "Since I was 12, actually. My grandfather was a radio operator in World War II, and he taught me how circuits worked. Said understanding how things were put together was just as important as knowing how to take them apart." James paused, his expression growing more serious. "The Army built on that foundation. Helicopter maintenance requires understanding complex systems and being able to diagnose problems quickly. Lives depend on getting it right." Larry heard something in James's voice that suggested the weight of that responsibility still carried over into civilian life. The precision he brought to repairing Mrs. Chen's radio reflected standards developed in life or death situations where mistakes weren't acceptable. "Do you miss it?" Larry asked carefully. "The military, I mean." James considered the question while cleaning a vacuum tube with methodical care. "I miss the clarity of it. In the military, you know what your mission is, you know what success looks like, and you know your team has your back. Civilian life is messier. The rules aren't as clear and people don't always understand what you've been through." The honesty in James's response struck Larry deeply. He'd spent his career complaining about the uncertainties of the music business, but that seemed trivial compared to the challenge of transitioning from military service to civilian life. "Is that why you come here?" Larry asked, gesturing toward the workshop and the other veterans working on various projects. Partly, but also because this work gives me purpose. When Mrs. Chen's radio plays music again, that matters. When I help rebuild a rocking chair for someone's nursery, that matters. It's not saving lives, but it's making lives a little better. Sarah, who had been quietly observing the conversation, spoke up. James volunteers here 20 hours a week. He's helped establish the entire repair program and trained several other veterans in electronics work. Larry could see why Sarah valued James so highly. Despite his own struggles, he was contributing to his community in meaningful ways and helping other veterans find purpose and connection. The workshop buzzed with quiet productivity, and it was clear that James's leadership was part of what made it successful. "James," Larry said, "I'm performing at the Riverside Theater on Saturday night, and I understand you'll be there. Is there anything special you'd like to hear? Any songs that have particular meaning for you?" James smiled for the first time since they'd been talking. "Honestly, anything would be great. It's been a long time since I've been to a live music show. The crowds, well, sometimes they're hard for me." But Sarah assured me it'll be a friendly, smaller audience, and I'm looking forward to it. Larry noticed the way James's expression had shifted when he mentioned crowds, suggesting that PTSD symptoms might include anxiety in social situations. He made a mental note to ensure Saturday's show felt as comfortable and welcoming as possible. "It'll definitely be intimate," Larry assured him. "The Riverside is a beautiful little theater, very warm and inviting. And the audience will be people like you and Maria Rodriguez, neighbors and community members, not industry people or critics." "Maria Rodriguez?" James asked. "The woman with the 3 kids who lost her job at the plant?" "Sarah's been helping her family too. Tough situation, but she's handling it with incredible grace." Larry was struck by the way James knew about Maria's circumstances and spoke about her with genuine respect and concern. Despite facing his own challenges, James was aware of and cared about what others in his community were going through. "You know Maria? We've crossed paths at various community events. Her youngest son, Miguel, is fascinated by anything mechanical. He spent an hour here last month watching me rebuild a toaster, asking questions the whole time. Smart kid with a curious mind." The interconnectedness of the community was becoming clearer to Larry. These weren't isolated individuals struggling with separate problems. They were neighbors who knew each other, supported each other, and cared about each other's well-being. Saturday's show wouldn't just be a performance for strangers. It would be a gathering of people who were already connected by geography, circumstance, and mutual concern. As they prepared to leave the workshop, Larry found himself thinking about the stories he'd learned over the past few days. Maria's determination to provide stability for her children. James's transition from military precision to civilian uncertainty while maintaining his commitment to helping others. Sarah's dedicated work, connecting resources with needs in her community. "James," Larry said as they shook hands goodbye, "thank you for sharing your time and your story with me. I have a feeling Saturday's show is going to be more meaningful than I originally expected." "Thank you for taking the time to get to know us," James replied. "It means more than you might realize, having someone of your stature care about our individual stories." Walking back to Sarah's car, Larry reflected on the afternoon's conversation. James Thompson was clearly a man of substance and skill, someone dealing with real challenges but approaching them with dignity and purpose. His commitment to helping others despite his own struggles demonstrated a kind of strength that Larry found both humbling and inspiring. "Sarah," Larry said as they drove away from the community center, "how do you do it? How do you work with people facing such difficult circumstances every day without becoming overwhelmed by it all?" Sarah was quiet for a moment, navigating traffic while considering her response. "I guess I've learned that everyone has a story, and everyone deserves to have that story heard and respected. People like Maria and James aren't looking for pity. They're looking for opportunity, understanding, and sometimes just recognition that they're doing their best in tough situations. It's remarkable how strong they are," Larry observed. "Both of them are facing challenges that would break some people, But they're not just surviving, they're contributing to their community and taking care of others. That's what I see every day in this work. People who could easily focus entirely on their own problems, but instead find ways to help their neighbors. It restores your faith in human nature, honestly. Larry nodded, understanding more clearly why Sarah was so passionate about her work. She wasn't just providing social services, she was witnessing daily examples of human resilience and compassion that most people never had the opportunity to see. That evening, Larry sat at his piano and found himself thinking about the conversation with James. The veteran's mention of restoration, taking something broken and making it meaningful again, resonated deeply. Larry began playing around with chord progressions that felt like they could carry that theme. Music that could honor both the breaking and the healing that seemed to define so many people's experiences. As he played, Larry realized that his own story of career decline and potential renewal was just one thread in a much larger tapestry of human experience. Saturday's show was beginning to feel less like a performance and more like a celebration of the resilience, dignity, and mutual support he was discovering in this Nashville community. The music emerging from his piano that night carried new emotional weight, inspired not by his own circumstances, but by the stories of people like Maria and James who were living their lives with courage and grace despite facing significant challenges. For the first time in years, Larry felt like his music might actually matter to people in ways that went beyond entertainment. Saturday night was still 2 days away, but Larry could already sense that something special was going to happen at the Riverside Theater. The foundations were being laid not just for a performance, but for a moment of genuine connection between an artist and his community, a reminder of why music exists in the first place. Saturday afternoon sunlight streamed through the tall windows of the Riverside Community Theater as Larry Gatlin arrived for his sound check. The venue looked different in daylight, smaller and more intimate than he'd expected, but with a warmth that immediately felt welcoming. The stage, though modest in size, was perfectly proportioned for the space, and the rows of worn velvet seats suggested decades of performances that had brought joy and meaning to this corner of Germantown. Marcus Thompson was already there, directing the sound technicians and adjusting equipment with the efficiency of someone who'd managed countless shows. At 73, Marcus moved with the careful precision of a man who understood that attention to detail made the difference between a good show and a memorable one. "How's it looking?" Larry asked, setting his guitar case down near the piano that had been positioned stage left. "Better than I expected," Marcus replied, adjusting a microphone stand. "The acoustics in here are actually quite good. Intimate, but not muddy. You'll be able to really connect with the audience without having to overpower them." Larry nodded, running his hands along the piano keys and listening to the natural reverb of the room. The instrument was older but well-maintained, with a warm tone that would complement his voice nicely. As he began running through scales and chord progressions, he noticed Sarah Mitchell entering through the theater's main doors, followed by Maria Rodriguez and her 3 children. "I hope we're not too early," Sarah called out. "The kids have been excited about this all week." Isabella, Diego, and Miguel clustered near their mother, eyes wide as they took in the theater space. For children accustomed to entertainment delivered through screens, the physical reality of a performance venue clearly held special magic. Diego immediately pulled out his sketch pad and began drawing the stage setup, while Miguel pointed excitedly at the lights hanging above. "You're right on time," Larry said, stepping down from the stage to greet them. "I thought maybe Diego and Isabella might like to see what a sound check actually involves, and Miguel can help me test whether the microphones are working properly." Maria smiled, and Larry could see her visibly relax as she realized her children were genuinely welcome. "They've been asking questions all morning about how concerts work. I'm afraid my knowledge of the technical side is pretty limited." "Well then, we'll all learn something new today," Larry replied. "Marcus, would you mind if we had some extra help with the sound check?" Marcus, who had 3 grandchildren of his own, immediately warmed to the idea. "Absolutely. In fact, having young ears can sometimes help catch things we old-timers miss." For the next hour, Larry's sound check became an impromptu educational experience. He explained how the microphones picked up sound, how the mixing board balanced different instruments, and how the stage lights created the right atmosphere for performance. Diego sketched constantly, capturing details that impressed even Marcus with their accuracy and artistic vision. Isabella asked thoughtful questions about song selection and audience engagement, showing an intuitive understanding of performance that suggested she'd inherited some of her great-grandmother Carmen's musical sensibilities. Miguel, initially shy, gradually warmed up and began testing microphones with enthusiasm, delighting in hearing his voice amplified through the theater's sound system. "The amazing thing," Larry explained to the children, "is that all this technology exists to help create a connection between the performer and the audience. It's not really about the equipment, it's about the feeling that passes between people when music is shared." As if summoned by that observation, James Thompson appeared at the theater's entrance, followed by an elderly Asian woman Larry assumed was Mrs. Chen. James looked more relaxed than he had at the community center, and he carried what appeared to be the restored vintage radio he'd been working on. "Mrs. Chen wanted to meet you," James explained as they approached the group, "and I thought you might like to hear how her radio turned out." Mrs. Chen, who appeared to be in her 80s, moved with careful dignity and held the radio like it was precious cargo. Her English carried a slight accent, but her words were clear and warm. "Mr. Gatlin, James told me you are performing tonight. My husband and I, we loved music very much. This radio, it played our songs for 40 years. James had clearly explained the radio's significance to Larry, and Larry could see the pride in the veteran's eyes as Mrs. Chen prepared to demonstrate his repair work. "Would you like to hear it?" she asked. "I would be honored," Larry replied. Mrs. Chen turned a dial, and after a moment of static, the radio came to life with the clear, warm tones of a local classical music station. The sound quality was remarkable for such an old device, and Larry could see that James's restoration had been meticulous and loving. "It sounds beautiful," Larry said sincerely. "James, you've given Mrs. Chen back a piece of her history." "He did more than that," Mrs. Chen said softly. "When this radio plays, I hear my husband's voice again. The songs we danced to, the news programs we listened to together, the music that filled our home. James gave me back my memories." The simple power of that statement affected everyone present. Even the children seemed to understand that they were witnessing something profound, the restoration not just of an electronic device, but of a connection to love and loss that transcended mere functionality. "Mrs. Chen," Larry said gently, "would it be all right if I mentioned you and your radio during tonight's show? I'd like people to know about the beautiful work James does and the importance of preserving the things that connect us to the people we love." Tears gathered in Mrs. Chen's eyes, and she nodded. "My husband would be so proud to know his radio brought music to others again." As the afternoon continued, Larry found himself surrounded by the community that would be his audience that evening. Maria's children explored every corner of the theater with Sarah's patient supervision, while James and Mrs. Chen shared stories about the various items he'd repaired over the past months. Each restored object came with its own narrative of loss, hope, and the human desire to preserve meaningful connections. The theater's artistic director, Jennifer Walsh, arrived to check on final preparations and was delighted to see the informal gathering that had developed around Larry's sound check. "This is exactly what we hoped for when we started the Community Benefit Series," she told Larry. "Music bringing people together, creating connections that go beyond just entertainment. It's become much more than I expected," Larry admitted. "These people have shared their stories with me, and now I want to make sure tonight's show honors what they've been through and what they represent." Jennifer smiled. "That's what the best performers do. They don't just sing to an audience, they sing with a community." As the sound check formally concluded and people began preparing to leave for dinner before the evening show, Larry felt a profound shift in his understanding of what he was about to do. This wasn't just another gig to help pay his bills, nor was it simply a chance to reconnect with his love of performing. Tonight's show had become something much more significant. A celebration of the resilience, creativity, and mutual support he'd discovered in this Nashville neighborhood. "Larry," Maria said as she gathered her children, "thank you for including us in all this." Isabella hasn't stopped talking about the microphones, and Diego filled half his sketch pad. They feel like they're part of something special. "They are part of something special," Larry replied. "We all are." As the theater emptied and Larry packed his instruments, he found himself thinking about the evening ahead. The audience would include Maria struggling to provide stability for her children, James working to find his place in civilian life while helping others, Mrs. Chen cherishing memories preserved in an old radio, and Sarah dedicating her career to connecting resources with needs in her community. These were people living real lives with real challenges and real grace. They deserved more than just entertainment. They deserved recognition, celebration, and affirmation that their stories mattered. Tonight's show needed to be about them as much as it was about him. Marcus finished packing the sound equipment and approached Larry with a curious expression. "I've never seen you like this before a show," he observed. "You seem different, more focused, but also more relaxed." "I think I finally understand what this is really about," Larry replied. "For years, I've been trying to recapture something I thought I'd lost: success, recognition, relevance. But what I actually lost was connection to the reason I started making music in the first place, which was to tell stories that matter to people who need to hear them, to create moments where folks feel less alone and more understood." Larry gestured toward the empty theater. "These people have reminded me what that looks like." As they locked up the theater and prepared for the evening show, Larry felt a familiar excitement building. Not the nervous energy of someone hoping to revive a fading career, but the genuine anticipation of an artist about to share something meaningful with people who would truly appreciate it. Tonight's performance at the Riverside Community Theater was going to be special, but not in the way Larry had originally imagined. Instead of being about his return to relevance, it was going to be about community, connection, and the power of music to acknowledge and celebrate the dignity found in ordinary lives, extraordinarily lived. The stage was set, literally and figuratively, for something that would surprise everyone present, including Larry himself. The evening ahead would transform not just how he understood his role as a performer, but how he understood his responsibility to use his gifts in service of something larger than his own career ambitions. The Riverside Community Theater buzzed with gentle anticipation as audience members found their seats on Saturday evening. Larry Gatlin stood in the wings, watching through a gap in the curtains as the theater filled with faces that had become familiar over the past week. Maria Rodriguez sat with her 3 children in the 4th row, Isabella wearing what was clearly her best dress, Diego clutching his sketch pad, and young Miguel wide-eyed with excitement. James Thompson had chosen an aisle seat near the back, Mrs. Chen beside him with the restored radio carefully placed in her lap like a treasured companion. The audience was smaller than the venues Larry had played during his peak years, but it possessed something those larger crowds had often lacked: a sense of genuine community and shared purpose. These weren't strangers who had purchased tickets for entertainment. They were neighbors who had come together to support each other and celebrate the resilience they had found in their shared experiences. Sarah Mitchell approached from the lobby, carrying a clipboard and wearing a smile that suggested the evening was exceeding her hopes. "The theater is about 3/4 full," she reported to Larry. "We have families from the neighborhood, veterans from James's support group, several elderly residents who knew Mrs. Chen's story, and quite a few community volunteers. Everyone seems excited." Larry nodded, feeling a mix of nerves and anticipation, unlike anything he'd experienced in recent years. This wasn't performance anxiety about vocal technique or song selection. It was the profound responsibility of knowing that his music tonight needed to honor the stories he'd been privileged to hear. "Sarah," he said quietly, "before I go on, I want you to know that meeting these people this week has changed something fundamental for me. Whatever happens tonight, this experience has reminded me why music matters." Jennifer Walsh, the theater's artistic director, joined them in the wings. 5 minutes until showtime, Larry. The energy out there is beautiful. I can feel how much this evening means to everyone." As Larry prepared to take the stage, Marcus Thompson gave him an encouraging nod from behind the soundboard. The two men had worked together for decades, and Marcus seemed to sense that tonight's show would be different from anything they'd done before. Larry stepped into the warm stage lights, and the audience's applause felt more like a welcome home than a performance introduction. He took his position behind the piano, adjusting the microphone and looking out at the faces before him. "Good evening, everyone," he began, his voice carrying easily through the intimate space. "I'm Larry Gatlin, and I have to tell you, this is probably the most meaningful show I've done in years, though it might also be the smallest venue." Light laughter rippled through the audience. "But I've learned this week that sometimes the most important things happen in quiet places, with real people sharing honest stories." Larry's fingers found the opening chords of All the Gold in California, one of his signature songs. But as he began singing, he realized he was performing it differently than he had in decades. Instead of showcasing vocal technique or trying to recapture past glory, he was offering the song as a gift to people who understood something about dreams deferred and the resilience required to keep hope alive. When the song ended, the applause was warm and sustained, but Larry barely paused before transitioning into his next selection. "This week, I had the privilege of meeting Maria Rodriguez and her 3 beautiful children," he said, gesturing toward their section. "Maria told me about her grandmother Carmen, who loved music and said it was what made a house feel like home. This next song is dedicated to Carmen's memory and to all the grandmothers who filled our lives with music and love." Larry began, "I Don't Want to Cry." The song Maria had mentioned was her grandmother's favorite. But as he sang, he could see Maria wiping away tears, and he realized he was performing not just a song, but a connection to memory, to family, to the continuity of love that transcends loss. The evening continued with Larry sharing brief stories about the people he'd met, weaving their experiences into introductions for songs that suddenly carried new relevance and meaning. He spoke about James Thompson's work, restoring broken things and making them meaningful again, introducing a tender version of "Houston Means I'm One Day Closer to You" that acknowledged both separation and the hope of eventual reunion. "James," Larry said, looking directly at the veteran, "you taught me that restoration isn't just about fixing what's broken. It's about honoring what was valuable in the first place and giving it new life. Thank you for that wisdom." James nodded acknowledgement, and Larry could see him visibly moved by the recognition. As the show progressed, Larry found himself departing from his planned set list, choosing songs and sharing stories that responded to the energy and emotion he felt from his audience. The formal distance between performer and audience dissolved, replaced by something that felt more like a conversation among friends who had gathered to share music and meaning. "Mrs. Chen," Larry said, spotting the elderly woman in her seat. "James told me about the beautiful radio he restored for you, and how it brought back the music you shared with your husband. Music has this amazing power to preserve love and memory, doesn't it?" Mrs. Chen smiled and nodded, holding up the radio slightly so others could see it. "Mrs. Chen's radio got me thinking about all the ways we preserve the things that matter to us. Sometimes it's through objects, sometimes through stories, and sometimes through songs that remind us we're not alone." Larry began playing a gentle instrumental piece he'd composed years ago but rarely performed, a melody that seemed to capture both melancholy and hope. As the evening moved toward its conclusion, Larry felt something building inside him, an emotional crescendo that had nothing to do with vocal technique and everything to do with genuine feeling. He'd performed hundreds of shows over his career, but nothing had ever felt as important as this moment, in this small theater, with these particular people. "I came here tonight thinking I was just doing a job," Larry said, his voice taking on deeper intensity. "A paying gig to help with my bills, if I'm being honest. But what I found instead was a community of people who have taught me more about strength, dignity, and hope than I learned in decades of performing." The audience had grown very quiet, sensing that something significant was happening. "I've met a single mother who lost her job but hasn't lost her determination to provide for her children. I've met a veteran who channels his skills and compassion into helping others, despite facing his own daily battles. I've met an elderly woman who cherishes memories preserved in a radio restored by caring hands. And I've met a social worker who dedicates her life to connecting people with the help and recognition they deserve. Larry paused, looking around the theater at faces that had become precious to him over the course of a single week. These people don't need my pity or my charity. What they deserve is recognition, celebration, and support. They deserve to know that their stories matter, that their struggles are seen, and that their strength inspires others. Larry stood up from the piano and moved to the center of the stage, his voice growing stronger and more passionate. Tonight, I was paid $3,000 to perform for you. And I want you to know that every penny of that money is going directly to the families and individuals here who could use some extra support. A gasp ran through the audience, followed by stunned silence. Larry could see Maria's hand fly to her mouth in shock, James sitting straighter in his seat, and Sarah staring at him with wide eyes. "This isn't charity," Larry continued firmly. "This is community. This is recognition that we're all connected, that your struggles matter to me, and that sometimes we have the opportunity to help each other in ways that go beyond applause and appreciation." The silence in the theater was profound, and Larry could see tears on many faces. But these weren't tears of pity or embarrassment. They were tears of recognition, of feeling seen and valued in ways that went beyond mere sympathy. "Sarah Mitchell," Larry called out, "would you please come up here and help me figure out how to distribute this money appropriately? You know these families better than anyone." Sarah slowly made her way to the stage, clearly overwhelmed by what was happening. When she reached Larry, she whispered, "Are you sure about this?" "I've never been more sure of anything," Larry replied, loud enough for the audience to hear. "This is what music is supposed to do: bring people together, create connection, and sometimes provide practical help when it's needed." The audience erupted in applause, but it wasn't the polite appreciation of a typical concert conclusion. This was something deeper. Recognition of a moment when art and life intersected in ways that transformed everyone present. As the applause continued, Larry saw Maria Rodriguez stand up, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you," she said simply, but the two words carried the weight of a mother's gratitude for unexpected hope. James Thompson also stood, followed by Mrs. Chen, and then the entire audience was on its feet. But they weren't just applauding Larry's gesture. They were celebrating the sense of community and mutual support that had been created in that small theater on a Saturday night in Nashville. Larry returned to the piano for one final song, choosing "Amazing Grace," because it felt like the only hymn that could adequately capture the sense of transformation he felt. As he sang, voices from the audience joined in, creating the kind of spontaneous harmony that can't be rehearsed or manufactured. When the song ended and the evening officially concluded, people didn't rush to leave. Instead, they gathered around the stage, sharing stories and connections that extended far beyond the concert they'd just experienced. Larry found himself surrounded by audience members who wanted to thank him, but also to share their own stories and to connect with each other in ways the evening had inspired. Maria Rodriguez approached with her children, all of whom seemed to understand that something extraordinary had happened, even if they couldn't fully articulate what it was. "Larry," Maria said, "I don't know how to thank you for what you've done, not just tonight but all week. You've made us feel seen and valued in ways we hadn't experienced in a long time. Maria, you and your children taught me more than I taught you. You showed me what real strength looks like, what dignity means, and how love sustains us through difficult times." Diego held up his sketch pad, showing a drawing of Larry at the piano with music notes floating up toward faces in the audience. "This is what tonight felt like," he said. "Like the music was connecting everyone together." Larry studied the drawing, impressed once again by Diego's artistic insight. "That's exactly what it felt like to me too, Diego. You captured something I couldn't put into words." As the evening wound down and people gradually said their goodbyes, Larry found himself changed in ways he was still processing. The $3,000 he'd donated represented his entire fee for the performance, money he'd counted on to help with his own bills. but the decision felt right in ways that transcended financial considerations. Sarah Mitchell was the last to leave, staying behind to help coordinate how the donated money would be distributed among the families who could benefit most. "Larry," she said, "what you did tonight will help these families in practical ways, but the larger impact goes beyond money. You showed them that their stories matter, that they're valued members of this community. Sarah, I think I got more out of this than anyone else. These people reminded me why I became a musician in the first place, to create connections, to tell stories that matter, and to use whatever gifts I have in service of something larger than my own success." As Larry packed his instruments and prepared to leave the Riverside Community Theater, he reflected on how profoundly the past week had changed him. He'd arrived at this gig thinking about career revival and financial necessity. He was leaving with a renewed sense of purpose and a deeper understanding of what his music could accomplish when it was offered in genuine service to others. The drive home through Nashville's quiet streets gave Larry time to process the evening's events. The spontaneous decision to donate his entire fee had surprised even him, but it felt like the only appropriate response to the generosity of spirit he'd encountered from Maria, James, Mrs. Chen, and the entire community. At home, Larry sat at his piano one final time before bed, but instead of worrying about career concerns or financial pressures, he found himself composing music inspired by the faces and stories he'd encountered over the past week. The melodies emerging were different from anything he'd written in years. More honest, more connected to real human experience, more worthy of the lives they sought to honor. Outside his window, Nashville slept under a canopy of stars. But Larry Gatlin felt more awake and alive than he had in years. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges and uncertainties, but tonight had reminded him that the most meaningful performances happen when artists stop trying to take something from their audience and start looking for ways to give something back. The show at the Riverside Community Theater had officially ended, but its impact would ripple through the lives of everyone present for weeks and months to come. Larry had rediscovered his purpose as an artist. The community had experienced the power of mutual support, and music had once again proven its ability to transform ordinary moments into something extraordinary. In years to come, people would remember this evening not just as a concert, but as a reminder that the best of human nature emerges when we choose to see and celebrate each other's dignity, resilience, and fundamental worth. Larry Gatlin had given away $3,000, but what he'd received in return was immeasurably more valuable. A restored sense of purpose, renewed faith in human goodness, and the knowledge that his music could still matter in ways that transcended entertainment. The lights of the Riverside Community Theater had dimmed, but the warmth generated that evening would continue to illuminate lives and hearts long after the last note had faded into the Nashville night.